Speaker.
On a point of order?
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to move a motion of censure of the Prime Minister.
I asked you, did you have a point of order?
I'm seeking leave to move a motion of censure of the Prime Minister for his repeated failure to uphold established principles of ministerial government. You going to take it? I move that this House censures the Prime Minister for his repeated failure to uphold established principles of ministerial government, as shown by A, his failure to dismiss the Treasurer for his flagrant, premeditated and unprecedented breach of Cabinet solidarity, B, his failure to dismiss the Minister for Justice and Consumer Affairs for failing to meet the required standards in the conduct of his office as a senior law officer of the Crown, C, his persistent weakness in failing to exercise proper control over statements made by his ministers, which have led to a lack of public confidence in his government, D, the inability of his government to declare and promote a coherent and consistent economic policy, and E, his failure to demonstrate the quality of leadership required for the effective government of the nation in difficult economic times.
Order. I take it that the Leader of the House has given leave, or we're moving to suspend standing orders. Leave's been granted.
The normal thing is to suspend standing orders. I would have accepted a suspension of no, you asked for leave.
No, order. Order. The member for Farrer will cease interjecting. The normal procedure in the House is that a member moves to suspend standing orders unless the government has given leave. Now, the government hadn't given leave, so I take it at this stage, unless the government's saying now they're giving leave, that you're moving to suspend standing orders. As leave is granted.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, in
order. I wouldn't suggest that it is just the government that might be in some error here either. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, an incessant theme of the Prime Minister's during the last election campaign, which he repeated dozens and dozens of times, was that if you can't govern yourself, you can't govern the country. And in the 50-odd days that we've had since that election, we've seen overwhelming evidence of the accuracy of that statement in relation to his government. The situation has now totally degenerated into one of a shambles. We've got conflicting statements by a range of ministers on key issues of policy. We've had personal attacks and abuse among government ministers and other members of the government, of ignorance of the plight of the economic circumstances of a range of all Australians, enormous uncertainty being created in the business community and beyond about where this country is at the present time, where it's going, and what damage will be done by the persistence of high interest rate policies of this government. And of course we have a total neglect of the proper role of the parliament in just the first week and a bit that this parliament has been back in operation. And today, on the 4th anniversary of the Treasurer's now infamous and I would say internationally damaging Banana Republic statement, he deliberately chose, and I emphasise the word deliberately chose, to mount a scathing attack on a fellow Cabinet Minister, not just any Cabinet Minister, but the third most important in the government, whose only crime, it seems, was to have disagreed with the Treasurer on his assessment of our current economic circumstances and in particular about the required pace of policy response. Now, it's totally unprecedented for somebody in the Treasurer's position to make such an attack on a senior Cabinet colleague, and he's a Cabinet colleague, I might point out to the House, whose credibility with the electorate and with the business community clearly surpasses that of the Treasurer's. There's no doubt in our mind that the Treasurer should resign, and if he's not prepared to resign, the Prime Minister ought to sack him. Indeed, such statements as the Treasurer made today are only made by somebody on their way out the door, either when they're just about to resign or they've just resigned. And the only reason he obviously hasn't, the only reason why the Prime Minister obviously hasn't attacked the Treasurer and pulled him into line, caused his resignation, is that he undoubtedly fears that this is the first stage of the Treasurer's run for the leadership of the ALP. The leadership is now a very real and a very live issue on that side of the House. Now, the Treasurer's obviously been frustrated in recent days by a series of events.
Order.
His criticism of his past Cabinet performance by Senator Walsh, for example, is one source of his frustration. Criticism of his performance by a host of others has been another sense of frustration. And of course, the fact that the Minister for Transport and Communications has been deliberately broadened, given a domestic portfolio with this father and son relationship that exists between the Prime Minister and the Minister, has obviously got under the Treasurer's skin. And of course, even Simon Green, the new Minister, has been given a run. For the first time, mark my words, leadership is a real issue and it's a live issue on the government side of the House. And this is the first time in 4 parliamentary terms that that has been the case. If you look at the statements made by the Treasurer today, for example, just look at the question that was asked by a reporter, and the question is, do you acknowledge it's a remarkable step for you to come out here and publicly admonish Senator Button like this? And what was the Treasurer's answer? No, it's just overdue. It's just long overdue. You only make those sort of statements when your vision goes beyond the job you currently have to the top job in this country, namely to the position of Prime Minister. Now, if we look at some of the other statements that the Treasurer made today, I think it's worth drawing the attention of the House to these statements. The Treasurer opened his remarks by saying that Senator Button has created the impression, he, amongst others, that he has a more ambitious program for reform than that which the government is generally adopting, or which, by inference, is being adopted by the Prime Minister or by me. Now, this is not true, he says, a direct and blatant criticism of some remarks made by Senator Button most recently yesterday. He then goes on to say, now can I say in a discussion we had a week or so ago on protection, in relation to cars and protection generally, I wanted to go further than Senator Button, as is usual on these 2 issues. And he then goes on to basically and fairly clinically bucket Senator Button's performance in Cabinet, taking the opportunity to reveal details of Cabinet discussions and debate which have before this time not been released, attacking Senator Button for servicing his client base, and then to go on and say, so I made it quite clear to the Cabinet and to Senator Button they regarded his proposal for a private arrangement with the car firms for another 5 or 7 years is totally unacceptable. And he went on and gave more and more details of the nature of the internal Cabinet room debates on the issue of protection, all designed, of course, to attack his colleague and to make statements of his position, which he's never prepared to make in this parliament, to make statements of his position on major issues of economic policy debate. And this comes on the heels of 2 instances last week where the Treasurer also, Mr Speaker, made major statements which were not made to the parliament, his principal responsibility. The first was, of course, his statement on their position on consumption tax, a dramatic U-turn from the position he'd taken in 1985, and one of the least substantive pieces of analysis is too good a word, least substantive pieces that has appeared on the issue of the consumption tax debate and the entire period since the middle 1970s when that issue was first raised significantly in this country. And then, of course, last Friday, in a briefing to EPAC, he gave a statement on the state of the economy, where he again made some fairly substantive remarks that should have been made in this House in response to questions or by way of ministerial statement. He has a total disregard, of course, for the standing of the parliament excuse me, and for his responsibilities in respect of the parliament. So our first point of our censure motion on the Prime Minister is to emphasise his failure to dismiss the Treasurer for what has been a flagrant, premeditated and unprecedented breach of Cabinet solidarity this morning, coming on the back of what has been a total disregard for the due processes of the parliament by this man over many years, but on several occasions in just the last 7 or 8 days. The second issue that we wanted to bring to the attention of the Prime Minister as a basis of censure of the Prime Minister has been his failure to dismiss Senator Tate. Now, the opposition, in the spirit of our approach to the fourth term of the Hawke government, with a strong desire, as I said last week, to raise the standard of parliamentary debate and to raise the significance and the importance of Parliament in the eyes of the Australian people, in the light of the fact that those people had voted significantly against both major parties in the last election, something of a plague on both houses. We took a careful and measured approach to the statements by Senator Tate. We raised a series of questions. We provided him with his opportunity in terms of his responsibilities to the Parliament to answer the questions of his Senate colleagues and then to answer the issue of censure in the Senate before we publicly went hardline on what should be the Prime Minister's position, as I did last Friday, that if he wasn't prepared to resign, then, given that it was such an open and shut case, he should sack him. And Senator Tate, in the process of that censure debate, actually laid himself on the mercy of the Senate and effectively pleaded guilty and asked the Senate to judge him according to that call for mercy. And the Senate overwhelmingly voted against him. So the central point here is that Senator Tate should have been either his resignation should have been offered, and I'm very surprised that he didn't offer it, but in the circumstances of the breach of ministerial responsibility that was the basis of that case, he should have been made to resign. Because he has the central role, he occupies the central role in the administration of law in this country. As Minister for Justice, he's required to meet particularly high standards. He's required to show, above all, probity and neutrality in relation to the administration of the law and the courts. And Senator Tate has clearly failed in his fundamental duty as a Minister for Justice in his comments to the media about a current drug prosecution. His failure to resign, as I said, should have left the Prime Minister with no alternative but to sack him. The Prime Minister should have forced his resignation for a number of reasons, but of course the principal reason, the open and shut nature of this case, the principal reason was his reversal of the fundamental onus of proof by pronouncing somebody guilty before trial. And that, apart from anything else, should have been the principal reason why Senator Tate should have been dismissed by the Prime Minister, because Senator Tate, more than most others in this Parliament, would have a very clear understanding of that basic principle, having been for many years a lecturer of law and indeed for part of his time Dean of a law school, and having had a number of years of practical legal experience. And that, apart from any other reason, should have been a basis for dismissal of Senator Tate. In the Attorney General's letter to the Prime Minister, for example, it stated that Senator Tate, and I quote, had lent the authority of his office to a positive assertion that the person arrested in Thailand was guilty. End of quotes. It seems from a newspaper report on the weekend that the Attorney General in fact thought Senator Tate should have gone. They can perhaps confirm that in the course of this debate. But there's no doubt that given the nature of the breach and given the experience of the man and his understanding of the law, he should have gone, and there should be no doubt about that. In the course of the debate the other day in the Senate, of course, Senator Tate admitted he knew about the arrest of the defendants in Australia. So I'd put it to the House, he must have had some idea that a trial was pending, and it was interesting and particularly noteworthy in the circumstances that he chose to make a major media event of those statements in the way that he did. So he must take responsibility also, Mr Speaker, for the failure of his office in this respect. Now, we've been told that his office was informed about the sensitive nature of the circumstances, and that if he had a press conference he wasn't to mention a particular Australian connection. We're told that he wasn't told by his office the detail of that call, but he must have had some idea about it. He's been well briefed on the issue, he's followed the issue, he's read the newspapers, and in the end he must take responsibility for his office even if it's not his particular failure. Finally, of course, he was apparently warned on the way to Melbourne by the Director of Public Prosecutions that his statements may cause a problem, and it seems that he made no attempt to do anything about that after those statements had been made. And finally, of course, we have the whole effort that took place last week with the exchange of letters between the Attorney General and the Prime Minister, whose sole purpose, I would suggest to the House, was to divert attention from the real issue, namely the reversal of guilt, and to try and play down or diffuse the issue before it was raised in an appropriate way through both houses of this parliament. So I have no doubt, on the basis of what Senator Tate said, the way he behaved in relation to his defence in the Senate, and the way the Attorney-General and the Prime Minister sought to divert attention from the real issue in that debate, I think it's a very clear-cut case that Senator Tate should have resigned, and when he didn't resign, the Prime Minister should have sacked him. The third and fourth elements of our basis of our censure of the Prime Minister today relate to persistent weakness in failing to exercise proper control over statements by ministers in relation to major policy issues, which have led to a lack of public confidence, and the related point, their inability to declare and promote a coherent and consistent economic policy. Now, just look in recent days at the run of comments that we've seen among senior ministers just since the election campaign, and I'm only picking out the major ones. But we've had the consistent statements by Senator Walsh, which have only really brought personal attack and abuse. People are not debating the substance of his criticisms, which of course they know to be right. We've had statements by Mr Dawkins, who's called for a major statement on micro-reform, and he's ruled out privatisation as an item on the government's policy agenda. Had Mr Willis admitting that the country is in a technical recession, being backed up, at least in the Broad, by Mr West. We've had the Minister for Transport and Communications, Mr Beasley.
The Leader of the Opposition will refer to ministers and members by their title, not by their name.
Okay, we've had the Minister for Transport and Communications, Mr Beasley, ruling out virtually every option for micro-reform as he's gone from one media interview to the next, being confronted with questions about issues in relation to the aviation industry or other aspects of micro-reform. We've seen him progressively narrowing the scope for potential micro-reform. We've had statements by the Minister for Industry and Commerce on consumption tax, which have conflicted with those of the Treasurer. And we had statements most recently yesterday by Senator Button, the Minister for Industry and Commerce, on the inappropriateness of talking about rising living standards in what are now very difficult economic circumstances in this country. And indeed, he directly conflicted with statements made by the Treasurer, for example, in the course of the election campaign, where the Treasurer had said, for example, that he could see an increase in real wages in each of the next 3 years. Senator Button, and in the context of some remarks by Senator Walsh, both of them have clearly put paid to that sort of statement. But there should be no doubt that this government has failed to set out a workable economic strategy for this country. Their vision cut out on the 24th of March. They have no policies. The Treasurer comes along in every press release and on every occasion which he comments on economic data and simply puts the same sort of arguments. You know, she'll be right, don't worry, the strategy's working. In the meantime, the country's sliding into the worst recession that we've seen in at least since 82-83, perhaps in the entire post-war period. We haven't got to the worst parts of that recession yet, with average Australian families seeing their homes put at risk, in many cases being forced to sell them, no significant prospect of a significant and sustainable fall in interest rates by the end of the year, record levels of personal bankruptcies and small business failures, a current account deficit that is nowhere near his objective of 2.5% of GDP within the next 3 years, running 5 to 6% of GDP, and he knows he won't achieve it, and inflation locked in at 8 to 9% with debt still accelerating. Our international standing, credit standing, has been downgraded twice in 3 years, and the Treasurer, time after time, statement after statement, press release after press release, simply denies that there's any sort of problem, that there's any issue that he should be directing himself to. And when the going gets tough and his colleagues, for example, say we're in recession, what does he say? We're not in recession. There's some crazy definition of a technical recession, for example, which everybody else in the world accepts but him. We're not going to meet that, even though we seem to be meeting the basic conditions. But our final point, and the key point in relation to the to round off this censure motion against the Prime Minister, has been his failure to demonstrate the quality of leadership that's required for the effective government of a nation in such difficult economic circumstances. And there could not be a better comment on that than the 4 previous points on which we've based this censure motion. He's lost control of his troops. He's got a number 2 that is already running for the number 1 spot. Yes. He's got a recent cabinet minister who knows better than anybody else just how spineless this government has been in terms of taking the key economic decisions. The simple position is this: you've engineered the problems, you've got no vision, and you totally lack the guts to put the appropriate policies in place that would turn this country around.
Order. The honourable member's time has expired. Is the motion